Is AI racist? So the big story from last week that we reported in AIdaily.us as it broke sometime in the middle of last week, is that Google had rolled out its latest AI version, Gemini 1.5, I believe, and it included graphic creation, right? Like all of these places, like ChatGPT, like Microsoft Copilot, they all have some way of generating images, right? And somebody went in and decided to use Gemini to generate images of historical, placed back in time, placed back in history. So, for example, they did something like, Native American Indians. They did Native American Indians. They did Nazis. They went back into history, and they had Gemini generate imagery from those time periods. Now, I don't think they asked Gemini for specific events in those time periods. They just asked Gemini for representations of individuals during that time period. And the huge controversy was that when they asked Gemini for individuals from that time period, then they got individuals from that time period which couldn't have possibly been there. It was overly African American, it was overly black, it was overly Asian. They took and they placed other races, and I disagree with the term race. I believe we are all of one race. We're the human race. But in the popular parlance of races, they took other races, they took underrepresented minority groups, and they put them in places where they wouldn't be. For example, in the 1940s Nazi representation, they had black Nazis. They had Asian Nazis. In the American Indian representation, they had Asian and black American Indians. Now you have to think to yourself, what's going on here? Well, obviously what's happened is that the programmers were pretty woke, and they wanted to make sure that the images that were generated were diverse. So they gave the AI the imperative that when you generate images of individuals, they need to be diverse. And they made this imperative stronger than the actual individuals who should effectively have been in that time and place. So when you ask an AI, can you do an image of a Nazi soldier in 1940s Germany? You are not specifying for them to be white. You are not specifying for them to be black or Asian. You're just specifying a Nazi soldier in 1940. And from every single image of a Nazi soldier in 1940, each and every one of them have been white. Same for the other image. If you say, I want to show an American Indian village of early America, you would expect that you wouldn't get black or Asians in that kind of representation. But it did, because some programmer at Gemini had decided that diversity was more important than accuracy of result. So you saw things like the image on this particular podcast, which is a black Elon Musk. Sure, he's an African American, but he's not black. So what's interesting about this is that there was a huge controversy about this. And it was really interesting what happened here, because I think it was way more of a controversy than it should have been. I mean, they could have just as easily laughed it off and said, okay, you know what, we made a mistake, and that was it. But they basically shut it down and said, okay, well, we're not going to show any of this stuff again. And then more and more examples would show up of this kind of wokeified programming of this thing. And the reality is that the AI, I mean, it's stupid. I can't imagine why people thought that the AI had any kind of intelligence here, because it was given the directive to show diverse individuals. And when it was given the directive to show diverse individuals at the same time as it was showing historical figures, it just went and said, well, there's nothing wrong with this. Now, I think the reason why it was such a huge controversy is that because people looked at it and they said, look, history is being rewritten. History is being rewritten. We are asking for historical depictions, and history is being rewritten to put individuals into a place that they didn't exist before. Now, some people unbelievably argued that, well, they were there, they just weren't in the representations we've seen. And in some of those cases, it's completely inaccurate because there were no Asians in North America during the time of the American Indians. Or blacks. None. It just didn't happen. The historical representation was incorrect. But some people saw this historical representation that the AI produced and started freaking out because they said, history's being changed. History's being changed. And believe it or not, some people actually thought that was a good thing because there were people of those nationalities, of those races around at the time. They just weren't around in those specific places or in those specific photographs. So some people actually argued for history to be changed. Now, I find that unbelievable because if you ask me, history is incredibly important. I even suggested at some place, I forget, I think it was on X, that what can we do about encoding history into the blockchain? Because it's not just AI that's changing history. Many, many things are being disappeared because, or memory hold, because people find them to be inconvenient at this time. It's kind of like burning a book because it offends the sensibility of today as opposed to the sensibility of the time. And if you ask me, it's incredibly important for us to preserve these historical documents exactly the way they are because they are showing us what that time was like. I think the example that somebody gave was the last spike. So the railroads were finishing across the country. So the Eastern Railroad and the Western Railroad were meeting somewhere in Utah. And there was a photograph of all of the workers on the railroad. And all the workers on the railroad were white, even though there were Asian and black workers on the railroad at the time. They didn't show up in the image. Now, some people argued, well, there were Asian and black railroad workers at the time, so why don't we create an image with them in it as well? Because if you do that, then someone will look at it and say, well, it looks like there was equality between the whites and the Asians and the blacks back in that time. They will get a misrepresentation of what it was actually like back then. So instead of us learning from that and going, we should never ensure that that happens ever again, we'll look at it and say, well, back in the 1800s, there was equality. Everybody was in the picture. It's incorrect, folks. It's not history. And if we change history, then we change our representation of what everything is like. There's some things that should remain the way they are. Everything should remain the way it is. But everything should remain the way it is, not because it was wrong, but because we know it was wrong and we want to make sure to make it right. We don't want to replicate those times. We don't want to revert those times into a time that never existed. We want to learn from those times. Those who suppress history or change history are doomed to repeat history. Negative history, positive history. History is immutable. I think at one point I said, let's put it in the blockchain. Let's pick a date. Let's pick 2008 or some date and say each and every event that occurred prior to this date, let's encode it in the blockchain so that someone at some point in the future can go back and say, wait a minute, what actually happened? Here is the source of record, the source of truth for all these things that happen in history. Because if we're going to change history, why not just put the moon landing in 1869? Why don't we have steampunk lunar landers? You see what I'm saying, folks? It's ridiculous. We need to maintain history the way it is so that we know, in the negative sense, not to do those things again. And in the positive sense, we know that we can build on those things. History should not be changed by AI, by humans, by anyone. It's super important. That's it for me for today. See you next time, and until then, don't forget to think future.